Welcome to part 3 of my 2028 presidential bracket video series. So if this is your first time watching this video, what I'm doing is I'm using CNN's website feature where, in the spirit of March Madness, they've created a 2028 presidential bracket for the 16 top Democrats and Republicans who could potentially win their respective primaries and go to face off for POTUS in 2028. So I have gone through and picked the people I think are going to win in each respective matchup, and now we are down to the final 8 candidates for Republicans, for Democrats. We're going to be having them face off, and that will lead to the final 4, and then we'll have that video coming out in a few days as well. Just to start you off, show you where things are right now, the final 4 remaining on the Republican side are J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Brian Kemp, and Glenn Youngkin, and on the Democrats, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, and Josh Shapiro. So now for J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, the number 1, as listed by CNN, number 1 Republican. He first defeated Josh Hawley in the first round, and then faced off against Ted Cruz in the second round, where I had Vance defeating him. As for Marco Rubio, Rubio faced off against Tom Cotton in the first round, and then he went on to face off against Sarah Huckabee Sanders in the second round in a very, very close matchup. I think much closer, Rubio versus Sanders, and I gave the nod to Rubio on that one. As for Brian Kemp, I had Brian Kemp face off against Elise Stefanik in the first round, and after an upset where Ron DeSantis lost to Donald Trump Jr. in the first round, I had Brian Kemp narrowly defeating Donald Trump Jr. after a lot of back and forth in the second round, having Kemp advance to the next round. As for Glenn Youngkin first started off by defeating Doug Burgum and then advancing to the second round where he faced off against Greg Abbott, where I had Youngkin defeating him. That's setting up the matchup of Kemp versus Youngkin. Then on the Democratic side of things, I have Kamala Harris, obviously the former Vice President of the United States and 2024 Democratic presidential nominee. She faced off in the first round against her former running mate, Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota. I had her defeating Walz. And then in the second round, I have Kamala Harris facing off against New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a very, very tight matchup that I think I did say would be very, very close, and I could conceivably see it going either way, but I did have Kamala Harris winning that matchup and advancing to the next round. Next, we have Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. I had him defeating Stephen A. Smith in what would be a very exciting first-round matchup, and then go on to the next round, facing off against Wes Moore, who I had defeating Andy Beshear in the first round in a close matchup as well, with Gavin Newsom nearly getting the edge there. Big part being Gavin Newsom has higher name recognition than Moore and Beshear does. Now we have Pete Buttigieg, who Buttigieg defeated Cory Booker in the first round. He then faced off against Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and this one really was a back and forth on this one. I went back and forth on who I thought would win this between Whitmer or Buttigieg. I did ultimately give the narrow nod to Buttigieg over Whitmer, but I could see one of these two being the Democratic nominee in 2028 without a doubt. And lastly, my final Democrat is Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania. Shapiro faced off against Gina Raimondo in the first round, defeated her, really without much of a problem, and then faced off against J.B. Pritzker in the second round, the governor of Illinois, after he defeated John Fetterman. And again, I think Shapiro made light work of Pritzker and advanced to the next round. So now we're into the final matchups, the final 8, starting with the Republican side of J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio. So just to give you an idea of where things stand on this front, I'm looking at it as a 1v1 J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio. Who do I think would win in a Republican primary nationwide of Vance versus Rubio? Who would get more delegates? Who would get a majority of the delegates and be the Republican nominee? And this matchup is more interesting, especially because I think J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio being the Republican ticket in 2028, such as President Vance and Vice President Rubio, I actually think could potentially be a Republican ticket in 2028. We know both Vance and Rubio were on President Trump's shortlist to be vice president, and we also know Rubio and Vance obviously are both in the Trump administration. Vance is vice president, Rubio is Secretary of State. So obviously they work together quite a bit. There could be a situation here where this does end up being the Republican ticket in 2028. But in this CNN matchup on the 2028 presidential bracket, we have Vance versus Rubio. Looking at what primary polling has been done so far, we can look at this, and J.D. Vance so far has led by big numbers in pretty much every single poll. Marco Rubio on these polling things are around 4 to 3% or so. I think Rubio is more likely to be a VP in 2028 than an actual president. Right now, everything shows J.D. Vance has a commanding lead over the rest of the Republican primary field. Now, obviously, we're in March to April of 2025. 2028 is a long ways away, so we don't know how things are going to develop over the next few years, how the Trump administration will be doing. Maybe the Trump administration will be doing bad and Vance will have no chance of winning. Maybe the Trump administration will be doing great and Vance is a shoo-in for 2028. We're not going to know until we get closer. But for J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio, I have J.D. Vance, the number one seed, the favorite, winning this matchup and advancing onto the Final Four, facing off against the winner of the next Republican matchup between Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. I think it's pretty clear there's going to be one very MAGA loyal Republican to President Trump facing off in the Final Four for the Republicans. And whether or not it's J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr. or Marco Rubio is up for debate. I think it'll be Vance in all likelihood. But Youngkin and Kemp represent a different part of the Republican Party. Both of them have at moments worked with President Trump, praised President Trump, and at the same time kept their distance from President Trump. Brian Kemp obviously has done it more vocally after the 2020 election. Glenn Youngkin more so campaigned to Virginia, accepting Donald Trump's support, but trying to keep the president at an arm's length to try and win over a lot of moderate and independent voters in Virginia in 2021, which did ultimately end up helping Youngkin win. If you want, we can look at the election history in Virginia. I'll show you in 2021. The governor's race did go to Youngkin by 1.9%. He won in the likely Democratic state in a very, very close election 1 year after President Biden was elected president. So a very impressive win for Youngkin. When you look at Brian Kemp, he got reelected in Georgia in 2022 by 7.5 points. He first got elected back in 2018 in a close race by 1.4 points. So Kemp has done a good job of getting elected in Georgia as well. And I do think in a Republican primary, he would be a very formidable candidate in the general election. How things stand when it comes to polling, that's where things get a little bit more interesting because right now Kemp and Youngkin usually either don't show up in polls or if they do, they're not getting more than 1 to 2%. So CNN has them ranked as 2 and 3 on their bracket. I'm personally not sure they would be ranked this high in my own personal rankings of 2028. Maybe I should do my own bracket. That'd be something fun to do, like my own rankings and such. But CNN has them 2 and 3. Between Kemp and Youngkin, who is more likely to advance? And you have to consider some factors here. One, we're going to have two different Republicans and yet two very similar Republicans, both of which are not going to be super well loved by the MAGA wing of the party, but not super disliked by them either. The only thing is, of the two of them, I feel like the one that's caught the most ire from the MAGA wing of the party is Brian Kemp. While at the same time, Glenn Youngkin really hasn't had the opportunity to really do so. But then again, a lot of MAGA Republicans are sort of lining up behind Brian Kemp to run for senator of Georgia and kind of banking on him to be the best Republican to try and win that race. So how this goes is really up for debate. I think if this was Donald Trump Jr. versus Glenn Youngkin, which I almost did, I almost had Trump Jr. beating Kemp. I think there's a realistic scenario Donald Trump Jr. actually wins this matchup. But I think between Kemp and Youngkin, it would be a close fight. I do actually think Glenn Youngkin would end up pulling it out. I think Brian Kemp would be a good governor of Georgia and a good senator from Georgia in terms of the Republican politics, but in a nationwide Republican primary, I'm a little bit skeptical on whether or not he can do that. Whereas Youngkin, at very least, won a very competitive Republican governor's map in a very, very likely Democratic state, which I think adds a little bit of national sort of like swagger or finesse to it, which I think Youngkin was able to do. And I think that would give him a little bit of a boost in a Republican matchup between Youngkin and Kemp. It would be very close, but I think Youngkin would advance to the next round. Now onto the Democratic side. I think this matchup is going to be one that is really, really fascinating. We have the former Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris of the state of California, going up against the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom. This is honestly something that very well could happen in 2028, and what a show, what a spectacle it would be. Kamala Harris was appointed the Democratic nominee for the Democrats in 2024 after Joe Biden dropped out of the campaign, and she lost the 2024 presidential election to Donald Trump. When you look at the 2024 map, Donald Trump getting 312 electoral votes, Kamala Harris getting 226. You could call this map a blowout. You could call it a close election. The real answer is it's probably somewhere in between. 312 electoral votes for Donald Trump certainly looks like a blowout, but when you go state by state, You had under 2 points in Pennsylvania, under 2 points in Michigan, under a point in Wisconsin, under 2 points in Georgia. Arizona and Nevada ended up being about lean Republican wins and likely Republican wins. So those were big. But a lot of their typical swing states were still very, very close. And when you look at where Kamala Harris is polling now, when it comes to the Democratic primary and how she's doing, right now, not as strongly as Vance, but she still is a very high favorite in the 2028 Democratic primary field. Whereas Gavin Newsom, who does not have the name recognition as Harris does, it's been well known for a while now that he wants to run for president in 2028. He's been doing a lot of national media and press tours. He has his own podcast he's been having guests on. I think Gavin Newsom could potentially be one of the most formidable candidates against Kamala Harris. But then again, how it plays out in a Democratic primary, things are very early on right now. Harris has the advantage at 36%, and with 23% in polling saying other, 13% undecided, there is certainly enough room for Newsom to come up out of nowhere and steal support from Harris and win. The only problem is, I think when it comes to Harris versus Newsom, the policies of the two are essentially going to be very, very similar and the same. The only difference is, do the Democratic voters prefer running it back with Harris or doing something new with Newsom? That's going to be the question. They both have the pedigree of being from the state of California, which is one of the largest states in the country in terms of population and area, has one of the largest GDPs. I think it would be like, top 10 in the world if it was a country in terms of GDP or something like that. So both of them have a lot of political weight to go with them and up against this matchup. But it comes down to, do the Democratic voters want to give Kamala Harris another chance or Gavin Newsom? It's really tough to say 3 years out, but of this matchup, I would actually give it to Kamala Harris over Gavin Newsom. The main rationale being she was just the vice president of the United States, and a lot of Democrats are giving her the excuse of she didn't really have a full 2 years or so to campaign. She only really had about 4 months after Biden dropped out. Maybe with more time, she'd be able to better convey her message to a lot of Democratic voters and independent voters. And Gavin Newsom, I think, would be a very strong, formidable opponent against Harris, but I think being the former VP just gives her a narrow advantage over Newsom in this matchup. And so far, the early polling data does show that. Will it change over the next 3 years? I'm sure it will. But right now, as of like the end of March, I would have Harris narrowly beating Newsom. And now the last matchup on the Democratic side, this is one that I think is a fascinating matchup between what direction the Democratic Party wants to go in. We have Pete Buttigieg versus Josh Shapiro. These are two people who both were seen as sort of Democratic rising stars. Pete Buttigieg in 2020 really came out of nowhere and caught a lot of national attention in the Democratic primary and in the news media. And Josh Shapiro, who was one of the finalists to be Kamala Harris's running mate in 2024, he also has sort of gotten a lot of national media and attention out of nowhere as well. Obviously, Shapiro represents the state of Pennsylvania. It's a very important state, very important swing state. Donald Trump just won the state of Pennsylvania against Kamala Harris in 2024 by a little bit under 2 points. It's one of the most important swing states in every single presidential election since 2016, when Donald Trump was able to win it for the first time by a Republican since the 1980s. Shapiro, being the governor of Pennsylvania, certainly gives the Democrats an extra boost in a pivotal state that they need to win in a 2028 presidential race. When you look at 2022, when Shapiro was first elected, he won by 14.8% against his Republican opponent, Mastriano. Now, while Mastriano is considered a very weak Republican opponent, almost a safe Democratic win in Pennsylvania is still a very impressive feat for a Democratic candidate and non-incumbent at the time. How Shapiro does in 2026 could be a big indicator. If it's a very close election, maybe he wouldn't fare as well in 2028, whereas if he wins another blowout election in 2026, maybe that could be a sign of stronger national sort of traction growing and turning into something in 2028. Whereas Pete Buttigieg really became a well-known Democratic name during the 2020 Democratic primary, coming up really out of nowhere, gaining a lot of media attention, doing well in the early primary states, winning the state of Iowa in the 2020 Democratic primary and coming very close in the state of New Hampshire. The question is, Buttigieg versus Shapiro, who would do better at getting a lot of voters out to support them? And that's where the question comes in. Buttigieg had a very passionate, dedicated following in 2020, invoking a lot of similar traits to what President Obama was able to do when he was running for office in 2008, getting a lot of Democratic voters, younger Democratic voters, excited to turn out and vote for him. Could Buttigieg do something like that in 2028? It also should be worth noting that Buttigieg was from the state of Indiana. He has since moved to the state of Michigan with his partner, so now he is from a very important swing state as well. Obviously not the same as Shapiro, but Buttigieg now lives in the state of Michigan, which also is going to be a very important battleground for the Democrats in 2028. So the question would come down to, are the Democratic primary voters more likely to turn out to vote for Pete Buttigieg or Josh Shapiro? And the biggest indicator we have right now is the early Democratic data on the polls for 2028. Right now, in pretty much every single poll, Pete Buttigieg consistently polls in second place behind Harris. He's usually 20 or 25 points behind Harris, but he's at around 10 to 11% in pretty much every single poll, whereas Josh Shapiro, the highest he's had in any poll, is around 6 to 7% and never really getting on the same level as Buttigieg. Obviously, there's a lot of undecided support and not really a lot separating Buttigieg and Shapiro, but I do think in a 2028 Democratic primary field, both of these candidates will be very formidable. Both, I think, could conceivably win a Democratic primary, but in Shapiro versus Buttigieg, I actually think Pete Buttigieg would narrowly get a very, very close victory against Shapiro, a large reason being getting a lot of younger voters to turn out and vote for him, and that would be just enough to help him in the early primary states like Iowa, like New Hampshire, like South Carolina, like Nevada, and getting those early delegates out, which would give him momentum in the states going forward, going into Super Tuesday. So with that, I have Buttigieg advancing to the Final Four, and now our bracket is set where the Final Four candidates facing off will be J.D. Vance going up against Glenn Youngkin, the number 1 Republican, going up against the number 2 Republican in the CNN rankings. And on the Democratic side of things, we have Kamala Harris, the former vice president, and the number 1 ranking by the CNN page, going up against Pete Buttigieg, the number 3 ranked Democrat on this list. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a like. Please remember to leave a comment below telling me your thoughts on this bracket, who you think would advance to the Final Four, who do you think would win the bracket in 2028. If your picks are different than mine, please leave a comment below. Tell me why. I'm very interested to read the comments and see what you have to think about this. As I mentioned, we're over 3 years away from this, so obviously things are going to change a ton, and really anything can happen at this point, so I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. Also, please remember to hit subscribe, as I post at least one new video every single day, so you're not going to want to miss those. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next video.